Today, the word multiculturalism, I will admit, is not a beloved word, least of all by me. I think a lot of people find it trite, find it jargony, but the first time I heard the word multicultural, it exercised a kind of magic over me because it was sort of like the way literature works, like the way that literature can dive and burrow into the specific and the finite, and out of that can find the universal. Multiculturalism for me was a word that I felt described the entire world as I knew it. And I feel a little bit silly saying that today, because today it sounds like a word that was a weapon used for a war that's past. And that war were the cultural wars. And in various rounds of the cultural wars, the word multiculturalism became a victim. It was attacked from all sides. People on the right thought that it was designed, multiculturalism was a design to marginalize and subordinate the dead white men who had established Western civilization. On the left, people thought that it was a distraction from issues of class, that it was a Benetton ad masquerading as a movement. Some people who were more nationalistically inclined thought that the word multiculturalism was just another way of describing self-hate, a way of hating yourself, your skin, your own stories, your own culture, your own people. So it was a word that was started off in my mind as being at its greatest possibility, a word that could encompass everything, but through the course of all of this criticism and all these cultural wars, the word became smaller, and it became crass, unloved, and eventually abandoned. But not by me. I remained a true believer in the idea of multiculturalism because for me, it was not just a trendy concept that was going to come and go, but it was the only lens that we could put on the world that could capture the entire world itself. So right now I'm going to hand the metaphorical mic to some of my authors, which is a very comfortable position for me to be in as an editor, and let them tell you a little bit about what multicultural storytelling is. In fact, there are 5 principles of multicultural storytelling that I'd like to share with you that I've learned from the writers that I've worked with. The first one is that it helps us to see the past with greater clarity. Several years ago, I met a woman named Nancy Rawls, who is a novelist and a writer, and she had recently reread The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, written by Mark Twain, a great American novel. And like a lot of us, she left it with mixed feelings. Huckleberry Finn, of course, is the great American novel by a lot of people's estimation. It's a book that takes on the primal American themes of identity and freedom, and it's written in the American vernacular. But at the same time, some of us who've read the book have left it feeling a certain sense of disquiet about the things that were, about the perspectives that the book takes, and maybe some of the absences in that story. Twain takes on these issues of freedom and identity, but he does it through the voices and through the perspectives of 2 young white boys, Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, who are the main characters, of course, of the book. Dimly in the shadows of the book, we also see a character named Jim, an escaped slave who joined Huck and Tom on their adventure. Nancy looked into those shadows that Twain had created, and she saw in the story of Jim an untold epic. The book she wrote was called My Jim, but Jim's story wasn't even really what Nancy was after. Instead, she told the story of the family that he left behind, particularly the wife that he left behind on the plantation when he left to follow Huck and Tom down the Mississippi River. Where Twain had only sort of dimly alluded to this family that Jim had left behind, Nancy gave it a name, and she named that wife Sadie, and she imagined into her an entire life. So Sadie also had her adventures in slavery and in freedom, but the core of her story really is about a series of losses. The loss, first of all, of Jim, the man she loved, but also the loss of family and friends, and the loss of freedom itself, but also how she endured those losses and how she moved on and was able even to pass on to the next generation the mandate to live and to love and to risk those things even with the always overhanging cloud of potential grievous loss. The book was heartbreaking and beautiful, and it won some awards, and it was eventually even made into a musical. But I took something else from it. After I worked with Nancy on the book, My Jim, I went back and read Twain again, and I read it in a completely different way. The book was transformed for me after my experience with Nancy. Jim suddenly came alive to me in a way that he hadn't before, and I could see between the lines of what Twain had written a different life for Jim, the life that Jim had left behind, the love that was hidden in his heart. And I saw things about freedom and about bondage and about love and about loss and about family that I could never have seen just through the stories of Huck and Tom going down the Mississippi. And that came because of the exposure I had to Nancy's alternate history of that. And so I felt like through the story of My Gym, Nancy didn't just sort of correct and complicate what Twain had written, but she had expanded the narrative. You know, she'd taken this great American story and made it more interesting because it told me what that great American story failed to show. And that is one of the great powers of multicultural literature. Another one is that it helps us see each other better. A few years ago, I worked with the great artist and entrepreneur Zs on a book. The book was called Decoded. And the book was kind of a risk for Zs to do because it was a book about his art. It wasn't a typical autobiography, but it was the story of a generation told through the lens of his art, which is rap music. And of course, the risk being that no artist wants to explain their art, and least of all does a rapper, because as Jay pointed out in his book, the poetic power of rap comes in a lot of ways from its encryption of language. But Jay, nevertheless, generously wanted to unpack that very powerful technique for readers and share it with them. After we'd worked on the book for a very long time and had gotten close to the point of publishing it, one day the proof pages of the book were spread out on the table of the publisher that I worked with at the time. And another writer came into the office, a writer named Kathleen Norris. Now, Kathleen is a very different writer than Zs, although they're both poets. Kathleen spent most of her adult life in the Dakotas in monasteries. As she said herself, like she would if given the choice between clubbing and chanting psalms with Benedictine monks, she would always choose the monks. But she sat there and she went through the pages of Z's book and she found herself fascinated and sort of riveted and took them with her when she left so that she could finish them. And when she was done, she wrote an email explaining the experience of having read Z's book. And she said that the way he decoded his rhymes reminded her of T.S. Eliot's Notes on the Wasteland. The way he talked about rap bending language and bending meaning reminded her of Emily Dickinson's famous quote, to tell the truth but tell it slant. And she loved the book. And it was kind of shocking, or at least unexpected, that the first reader that we got for the book and the first sort of positive feedback we got for the book that we created came from this spiritual, meditative poet who didn't even like rap music. So I sent the note to Jay, and he sent back a short note, and he said, "Take the books off the shelves, I'm good." And by that, he didn't mean literally take the books off the shelf, thankfully, but that this was what he wanted from the book all along. He wanted people to see themselves in his story, people of all kinds, and in that, see each other more clearly through the connections that they all had to the book. The third way that multicultural literature is of value, or multicultural storytelling is of value to us, is that it helps us see things that were previously invisible. There's a writer named Jill Leovy who was a journalist at the LA Times, and she was on the crime beat, but she got frustrated by the fact that the Times covered only a small fraction of the murders that happened in their city, in the city of Los Angeles in a given year. She knew what the bulk numbers were, and they were large, they were huge. In some years, there were 2 or 3 murders a day in Los Angeles, but she didn't know who those victims were, not really. She only knew it as a statistic. So she started a blog for the LA Times called the Homicide Report. And in the Homicide Report, she would report on every single murder that happened in Los Angeles in a single year. And the year she did it, there were 768 murders that she covered. And the thing that was previously invisible to the city at large suddenly became starkly and scandalously visible. Those murders all seemed to happen in a small handful of neighborhoods. In fact, what seemed to be 768 murders dispersed around millions of people in the Los Angeles area were in fact an epidemic of murders that were happening in a handful of small neighborhoods, and the victims were primarily young black men. Now, to some people that may be so unsurprising as to be not of any interest at all, and to some people it's the fact that it's so radioactive that they don't even want to touch it as a subject. But Jill didn't look at it just as a number or just as a way of confirming biases that she had had previously, but she saw it as a deep and profound human tragedy that needed to be explored and understood with urgency. So she found a story that allowed her to explore all the ideas she had about murder and about specific murders. It was a story of a young man, a beloved son of the city, as she called him, who, like hundreds of his peers, was walking down a street in his own neighborhood when he was shot and killed. But Jill didn't just say, okay, here we go, another case of black-on-black violence. But instead, she looked at it as a particular person with the particular perpetrator of the murder, who left behind a particular family that grieved him and friends. But more than that, she stepped back and she did research on homicide itself, from Reconstruction-era South to Russia, to Venezuela, to Greek mythology, and she ended up coming up with a theory about murder where she could take those people, those very specific people that she was able to bring to life, and see the ways that structures of policy and history worked on them and brought them to the point where they met and where the homicide happened. The book has become somewhat influential in policing circles and was a bestseller, has won many awards, but again, it shows us what we can do when we see the things that when we actually make the effort to see what's going on with our neighbors, with our fellow citizens, and dive deeply into stories that the mainstream would maybe have us avert our eyes from. Another power of multicultural storytelling is that it helps us see the future and imagine new futures. I worked with a writer named David Graeber, who is an anthropologist and an activist, and very influential in both of those things. And a lot of his thinking, he was considered to be one of the intellectual and on-the-ground activists who helped spark the Occupy movement. And David is an anarchist, a self-described anarchist, but he takes ideas, and he sort of synthesizes ideas from everywhere to sort of find evidence for his theories, but also tactics for his activism. For instance, he looks at the ideas of community from Ella Baker and SNCC from the 1960s, ideas about non-hierarchical consensus organization from feminists in the 70s, ideas about political autonomy from rebels in Chiapas, ideas for self-governing from groups in Madagascar, where he did a lot of his anthropological studying, and ideas about what American democracy is seen through the lens of working-class people at town halls and community meetings in the 18th century. And from that, he was able to synthesize new ideas about what our politics can be. So for a lot of us, when we think about politics and we think about change, we think about the system that's already in place. So we think about what can happen within that system, at what increments that system will allow us to create some kind of change. But David, by using a more multicultural approach, as I see it, was able to see something different and see something beyond the system as it exists. David sent me an email of a photograph that he had seen somewhere of a democracy protester in Hong Kong being arrested. And the protester was holding in his hand a copy of David's book. Now, we hadn't actually licensed the Chinese version of the book, so it was probably bootlegged, but you work with an anarchist, rules get broken. But what it told me was that this sort of panoptical vision that he had, that he was able to see and sort of synthesize and create a vision for a different future, is something that can spread, because we're all sort of desperately looking for ways to imagine ourselves past our present dilemmas. And a multicultural approach can actually do that for us. And the fifth way that multicultural storytelling, I think, is of great benefit is probably the way that we're most familiar with, because it allows us to see ourselves. And by that, I mean it allows us to see, more people rather, to see their specific lives reflected in the art around them, meaning characters who look like them, who talk like them, who come from where they're from. This is something that the curator and writer Sarah Lewis refers to as representational justice. But representational justice can actually be somewhat complicated. Another writer I work with is a young man named Eddie Wong. And when I met Eddie several years ago, or a few years ago, he was a blogger, and he owned a sandwich shop called Bauhaus down the Lower East Side. And he was someone who had an idea, and lots and lots and lots of energy. And his idea was he wanted to tell the story of coming of age in Orlando, Florida, a sort of nowhereville America, with what he called fresh off the boat parents, immigrant parents, and trying to find himself in this sort of American wilderness. So what started off as sort of a subversive take on the immigrant memoir ended up going into some more unexpected and even darker places. Eddie, like a lot of people of his generation, struggled to some degree in sort of reckoning with his own heritage and making sense of it, making sense of himself as both a child of immigrants, as an American, as someone who had once been a poor kid who became a rich kid, as someone who was a deliberate outsider in his own life. And the story ended up going into some places like criminality, violence, abuse, episodes of failure and alienation. And Eddie wrote it all in his own kind of melange of idiom that came from everywhere, essentially. And we published the book. The book got good reviews and eventually got made into a network television show, but a lot of people didn't know exactly what to do with Eddie. He was someone who was writing about experiences they thought they knew, this sort of immigrant American experience, but he was writing in a way that didn't fit any of the categories that they'd had before. It wasn't the old-fashioned version of like the sort of quiet observer of American culture. It wasn't this new idea of, immigrants as the model minorities. It was something very different. It seemed like a brash outlier, an island of one. So one of the first events we had for that was at the bookstore at Union Square, and it was a huge event, standing room only, a packed crowd, and it was a scene that actually became familiar to me over time from all the times I've worked with Eddie over the last 2 years. The crowd was a different crowd than you see at a lot of book readings. It was mixed, people from every conceivable background, but a very strong contingent of Asian American kids who, after the reading, didn't stand up to ask questions, but to give testimony, because they'd never seen someone like Eddie before, someone who was of their generation, someone who's in the culture, who spoke to them in a way that they recognized as their experience. And so they would stand up and offer their own stories at these readings. And I recognized that feeling, that sort of electrifying sense that here's a story that actually represents my life. Sarah Lewis called this kind of representational justice a contingent part of human dignity. You see your own story transferred into art, elevated, amplified, understood, and then shared to the wider world. But there's a flip side of that too, of representational justice. So my son is a big fan of Harry Potter, and recently we went to, in fact last week, we went to Orlando, Nowhereville, to the theme park they have down there for Harry Potter. And so he and I were sitting there, drinking our butter beer, and we were doing, using our magic wands to cast spells. And I looked around, and there were people from really all over the world. But they were all dressed now as if they were English boarding school students, with scarves and insignia, along with like dragons and broomsticks. And I thought to myself as I was walking down this sort of ersatz Diagon alley, I thought, this is as familiar to me as my own like childhood streets of Harlem. Why is that? Why do I feel almost as if I went to an English boarding school? Like, why do I recognize all this stuff? And of course, there's a reason for that. And a lot of it has to do with imperialism and colonialism and white supremacy that spread a particular vision of childhood and made it into all of our childhoods. And there's no question that J.K. Rowling's amazing world is built to some degree on that bloody foundation, but which in no way takes away from the magic of her story. But that, to me, is also kind of ironically an argument for multicultural storytelling, because all of us in the world, those of us who weren't raised in England at least, were able to see ourselves in a story other than our own. So the idea that we can only understand ourselves in our own skins is a lie, and it's a lie that all of us have known since the first book we read as a child, probably. I work with a writer named Ta-Nehisi Coates, who somewhat famous as far as writers go these days, but when I first worked with him on our first book called The Beautiful Struggle, he was pretty much unknown. But The Beautiful Struggle was a story of him growing up in crack era Baltimore, and it was told in such beautiful, granular detail and in an idiom that was really entirely Ta-Nehisi's. It drew from like wrestling and comic books and hip-hop and black nationalism and the peculiar argot of Baltimore in the 90s. In that sense, it was like Joyce, or even like J.K. Rowling. It took something that was very narrow, and it saw a world in it. Not many people read that book when it first came out, but one copy did find its way into the hands of Michael Chabon, the famous novelist and Pulitzer Prize winner. And he sent me an email, a lot of emails in this talk. He sent me an email where he said that the power of what he read in Ta-Nehisi's book, even though he came, he said, from a very different world. He came from Maryland as well, but he said, ages and classes and of course, a race away from Ta-Nehisi's own experience. But he felt in reading the book that Ta-Nehisi was telling his story to him. A year ago or so, there was a Random House, we had something called the Big Ideas Night. And Brian Stevenson, one of my authors, was there, as well as Ta-Nehisi, as well as Gloria Steinem. And one person came up to ask a question, and they said, can you just tell us what can we do to change the world? And Brian said, because Brian is sort of brilliant and eloquent at all times, he said, the thing you can do to change the world is imagine something that you've never seen before. And Ta-Nehisi, when it was his turn to answer, he's very bad at this sort of thing because he sees himself as someone who answers questions rather than someone who, someone who asks questions rather than someone who answers them. But he said, take the thing you love and bend it toward justice. Now, multicultural storytelling is not going to be some kind of panacea, but it is a precondition in some ways to the world that we actually want to see. And those of us who make stories and those of us who read stories and consume them, that is actually the work of justice we can do. And it's a work that can be mind-expanding, that can be beautiful, and that can be exhilarating for us all. Thanks.